The state of uncertainty is a thorn on the side of all beings who are aware of the discomfort it causes. As human beings, we use everything in our power to address it, to remove it, to cover it up so we don't feel that state of not knowing. We always are groping in the dark. Of course, for this reason, throughout history, documented history at least, we've seen human beings come up with ideas, concepts. What we see in the Western world being presented as philosophy, the term, that is, not that it was a product of a Western civilization, as in the case of Greek thinkers such as Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Philosophy, which means the love for or a lover of knowledge. Some people might disagree and say, no, love for or lover of wisdom, which depends on what it is. I've always looked for wisdom in Western traditions when I was studying Western philosophy proper, but I failed to see it. I never saw a step-by-step process. We do have the Socratic method and the Aristotelian way of scientifically looking at things, quote unquote. But also, essentially, it's nothing because it leaves you empty. These were people basically who were not living to address the bigger problem, which went beyond the intellect. And when I say it went beyond the intellect, I'm referring to the behavior of the individuals. Here I'm addressing a few questions from different individuals, which I'm trying to, put them under the same umbrella of a talk or Q&A type of a thing here. But essentially, when you look at Western philosophy in comparison to Buddhism, there's no comparison. And it's not because, I teach Buddhism or I'm a Buddhist monk because of those reasons, or no. It's, as I mentioned, when you look at the Dhamma, the teachings that we have from the Buddha himself, we see how at every turn there is a set of tools that are presented. For example, if a person is experiencing bad events in one's life, let's say, or trying to overcome bad habits. It could be bad thoughts, having outbursts, worrisome thoughts, or behaviors even, physically manifested behaviors. You can, for example, start with the four right efforts. Such as, well, what they mean is, are, in this case, is when there is, as I said, a negative experience happening to them, the first thing, that one has to do is to close the door. Stop the access of those negative things, influencers, from coming in. So the best example that one can give, one that I've given before, is imagine you have a house that is infested by rats. There's rats coming in, or some type of a pest. What do? Well, first things first, if you're smart, you're going to first look at the places where they are sneaking in from, the entry point. You address those. So first things first, in relation to 4 right efforts, you got to close. You got to eliminate those things that have not come in yet. So things that have not arisen yet, thoughts, negative thoughts, the influencers from coming in that are not there yet. And once you close that door, you go ahead inside and you look for the rats that have been stuck or caught inside, and you remove them. Okay? So that's the second aspect of. Then you're basically eliminating the chances. Eliminating the chances of the further infestation from coming in. You're protecting yourself. And then what do? What's the third? Well, the third is simply that you need to introduce something that is of the opposite nature. You present something good. If your house was muddy or moldy or smells bad because of all the excrement left behind, you need to clean it up. That's an introduction of cleanliness. Purity is being brought in. So you introduce something good. So if it was a series of negative thoughts infesting the brain, the mind of the individual in question, then you introduce positive thoughts. If the person says, well, it doesn't come naturally to me to think about positive things, well, this is the point where they need to start working on it. They start journaling, they start watching, let's say, talks, positive influence type of exposure, whether it's reading suttas, being inspired by some verses, doing, giving themselves a nice walk in the woods, in nature, taking a bath, eating healthy, exercising. So all these things can be listed in this case as positive, meaning the third right aspect of right effort. And then the fourth one is maintaining that. So here you have 4-pronged approach to eliminate suffering. This is only one, by the way. And when you go back to the Western thoughts of schools of thought, in their effort to deal with uncertainty, they've unfortunately dragged themselves further and further into the mud of ignorance. Now, why do I say this? Well, you cannot separate the thoughts of the person from the person. What I mean by that is the behavior. Socrates, everybody worships, when I was studying philosophy, Socrates, Plato, this and that. When I got deep into studying them, their biographies, I saw that, Socrates used to sleep around with young boys. There's no way of softening it, that fact. Well, where's the moral structure of someone who talked about virtue? Plato talks about virtue, of course. Aristotle taught the son of the king, who ended up actually being Alexander the Great, the one who went butchering his way throughout, from Macedonia all the way through the Middle East and all the way to doorway of India to spread his dominion. These were studying by top-notch of their day, top-notch philosophers. Aristotle, right? Where is the virtue? Where is the moral backbone of these individuals? So the way I understand it is that you cannot separate what a person is purporting to advance, some thoughts, some theories, some ideas. Because ultimately what we are looking at, now going back and looking at Buddhism and what Buddhism has to offer instead of this, it addresses the three poisons, what we call the three kilesas. Kilesas are the defilements that are within every single being. And what are these? Lust is one. The greed for more, lusting for more. The second is hatred, anger, aversion towards something, someone. And then the third one is the big one, delusion. So you have many, in the Brahmajala Sutta, which is the first sutta, the first discourse that we have from the Digha Nikaya, which are the list of 34 long discourses of the Buddha. The very first, The Net of Wrong Views, that's the title of the sutta in English. The Buddha talks about approximately 62 different wrong views that were prevalent at the time. Every single one of them were listed by the Buddha as wrong view, because they didn't see what was under their noses, the philosopher. Some were nihilists, some were eternalists, some were completely against the concept of kamma, or action, intentional action, having any bearing on the person, meaning no consequences. No consequences to, good actions or bad actions. So basically, whatever you could do and get away with it, good on you. Which is what we also see in modern world. In the West, we think of ourselves as being the, some philosopher comes up, somebody writes a book, whether it's Derrida, Wittgenstein, whether it's I don't know, pick one, Foucault, or Heidegger, or Kant, Marx, right? Nietzsche. We think, wow, this is novel. Well, I invite these people who think of these as novel to go and explore some of the already conceived of wrong views that have been there for ages. There's nothing new that the Western philosophical schools have presented, really. If we say it like it is, if we look at it the way it is, without becoming too attached to, oh, this is a Western thing, this is our thing. No. But anyhow, this is not a comparison on the cultural basis. This is in terms of truth. Because, as I said, you cannot separate the person from, and the person meaning the whole bundle. Nietzsche died of syphilis, He was sleeping around with prostitutes. Okay. People don't like to think about or look at the facts about these characters. Bertrand Russell, I think he was married 10 or 13 or 30 times, I don't know. Very unusual, to say the least. How difficult of a person you must be so that nobody could live with you, really, if you want to live like that, as in a layperson. These are just questions I'm asking. Because ultimately, the so-called philosophy that we are pushing for needs to bring in happiness and harmony, kindness, beauty, and an increase in the level of sanity in humanity, not greed. Communism, you look at Marxist and ideologies and you wonder, like, where's the beauty in this? What did this produce? Another thing that the Western philosophical schools have produced, one would say here, I guess I would be answering my question I just asked. You look at the political scene. You always must look at what's happening around the time of whatever was being pushed into the public's, focus. For example, in the late 1700s, you had the Enlightenment age, right? So-called Enlightenment, which had nothing to do with enlightenment as we understand it in Buddhism, right? Has nothing to do. Basically, these were individuals who had read some of this, some of that. They spoke a few languages, and they were now coming in and hanging out in these places called salons, or in French, salon, where the rich people, lords, baron this, countess this, count this, etc. And they were simply doing discussions and having these gatherings where they would advance ideas such as fraternity, liberty, equality, or equality, etc. All lofty ideals, which soon enough brought down the French monarchy a few years later. So I look at patterns. I've always looked at patterns growing up, and when I was studying and in school, and then high school, and then college, university. I've always been interested in patterns because I trust patterns more than what is presented to me. And when I say patterns, I look at I pull back. Pan out, and I look at what's beyond the scope of what I was seeing 5 minutes ago, when I was really, sticking my nose to the picture. You can't see anything. So separation is a big problem for the sake of separating. For example, in those days, in the Enlightenment so-called age, in the Western world, this is age of Benjamin Franklin's and all these people. They were part of secret societies, all these things. These are not conspiracies, of course. Anyhow, I'm not interested in discussing things like that, even though they're facts. They're there for anyone to go look for and find out for themselves. But they were separating the power of the church and state. This is where you can see them pushing for science, equality, the common man. And then you look at what ended up being the Constitution of the United States, breaking away from Great Britain, independence, etc., all that. And then you look at who exactly did this Constitution of the United States really refer to as a free man. What about the Indians, the owners of the land that now the white man was occupying? Nobody talks about that. It never discusses the Indians. By the way, Native Americans don't like the term Native American. They like Indian much better, from what I learned recently. So that's why I'm referring to them as Indians. They have their own term, obviously, which is more appropriate, but I don't know which one, what that is. They have the Iroquois, the Sioux, etc. But anyhow, as a collection of peoples, populations, which were decimated by the same people that were talking about egalitarian values, liberty, freedom, fraternity. Of whom? What are you talking about? Women didn't have any rights to speak up. And if you were not a slave owner, you cannot be included in the Constitution, technically. You don't have a voice to elect. And if you're a slave, forget about it then. You don't even count. So all these things, then you look at it from the political aspect. But they were seeing themselves as bona fide philosophers. You look over now to the East. You have in Islam, for example, or in the medieval Western world, you have the so-called Crusaders, the different phases of the Crusader wars that happened. Again, politically driven for money. You have the Templars, Jesuits, of course the Catholic Church. Now you have Mormons, you have the Jehovah's Witnesses, the same pattern. In Islam you had the same thing. The whole thing was designed on spreading and expansion in the name of philosophical new the betterment of man, a human being, society, values, connection with the higher forces. The Buddha's answer to all of these would be, all this depends on contact, which is beyond anything that you could look for and even find even a semblance of something that would address contact. Because all these individuals, all these entities, groups that I just briefly went over, they are run by the kilesas from the Buddha's standpoint. Because they are very much dictated by, run by, fueled by, the engine itself is run by lust, anger, and delusion. The Crusaders were chopping down Christians, killing countless people who were Christians. Long before the Europeans had taken on the Christian religion as their religion, to go ahead and kill, to spread, to collect from all these pilgrims. Same thing with Muslims to this day. So philosophy itself then becomes a tool of dominating. Aha. The Buddha never taught such a thing. The Buddha's main mission was simply to remove the person's suffering from one's life. Freedom from what? The Buddha is not talking about freedom from your oppressors that are outside of you, the rulers, the governor, or the authorities, or whatever. Ultimately, the governors will change. The leadership will change. No matter what they say they're going to be. They might sell themselves as saints, and a couple of months later you realize that, hey, they too were running on those 3 different fuels, which are not different from each other. Lust, hatred, and delusion. Here we come back to the role of the philosopher. Basically, these are armchair philosophers who never left their armchairs. They've never looked beyond their noses. They were in love with their conceit. That's what you see. To this day, you have characters like, I don't know, Zizek and other famous characters. Chomsky you have for decades, running in MIT, has a tenureship forever. And you look for what are they saying? What are they saying? It's just words. There's nothing. They're never addressing the real problem. And they're very shifty. Wisdom is not shifty. Wisdom cannot be separated from one's behavior. If there's any wisdom there, it is in the person who's able to look at, without any veils, without any special lenses, but just naked eyes looking at the person, to see how much of whatever they're claiming to be selling is really manifested. And what are they selling? They need to bring in, if they're saying that we are from the Enlightenment age group, what kind of an enlightenment are you bringing? chopping off Marie Antoinette's head. Violence, vicious, disgusting, appalling, has so much anger and hatred involved in it. How can there be freedom? How can there be, the French today, to this day, for all these centuries past, égalité, fraternité, liberté. There's, I don't know if it's in that order, but basically equality, fraternity, and liberty. Well, let's go back to France right now. Look over there. Is it any part of society that has that? Anywhere in the world that has that? Now, one might think that I'm saying everything that you see in Buddhism is, fine and dandy, is the right thing, this and that. What I would then draw is people's attention to the ignorance that was there, even in Buddhism, 100 years after the Buddha died, when they had the second council. Unfortunately, suddenly, barely 100 years passed since the Buddha's death, and you had 18 different schools. 18 different schools of thought. These are all monks, by the way. Everybody was advocating for their own way of understanding, interpreting this and that. Oh, this is what the Buddha said. They came up with their own books, interpretations, which we call them commentaries. Slowly, new books were introduced, giving the authorship to the Buddha, and then you go a few centuries further out, and you see in Mahayana new books completely. And now we're talking about, the Buddha having a different body, Sambhogakaya, and then Dhammakaya in the Vajrayana tradition. Really nonsensical, complete delusional, having nothing to do with what the Buddha taught. People were advocating for their own purposes. They were coming from their own intentions and manipulating ways of thinking, including teachings. People were the ones who were responsible for the Crusades. You look for that, you look for something like that in, for example, Jesus' statements, and I can't find anything that could justify the Crusades and, in medieval times, the Pope having his own armies, navy, which basically was the continuation of the Roman Empire, Caesar. It just shifted roles and outfit and the title, but essentially it was the same thing. In essence, the Roman Empire did not go away. All these centuries, 2 millennia, it's been there. In a sense, when you look at it from that angle, from that perspective. Anyhow, I don't want to deviate from the fact that human beings are the ones that manipulate. And we have to always look at whether there is the presence of lobha, dosa, moha, lust, hatred, and delusion. I don't care what it is. You have Herbert Spencer, a contemporary of Darwin, who came up with this social Darwinism idea. I think he came right after or somewhat contemporary. He was the one who coined the term survival of the fittest, which most people don't know. They always attribute it to Darwin. He wasn't. Here you have individuals who are social Darwinism. They're pushing for Darwinism, and this is happening around what time? Late 1800s. Again, political movements, Marxism, this, that, animal, the savage, evolution. So basically, we are the highest on the hierarchy of species type of a thing. And in those days, if you belonged to British society, a certain aspect, a certain stratum of the British social structure, then you were a civilized person. These are all facts. These are all there. Everybody else was not. especially if you had a different color skin, you came from a different part of the world, you were less than, you were subspecies. Again, this does not come the philosophy, mind you. This comes from the ignorance that lays in the heart of the person. So human beings, instead of looking for the right ways of understanding uncertainty and suffering, basically, to address that issue, we try to camouflage that painful reality by delving into more and more stupidity, driven by the machine that is in the heart, which has those 3 gears that I mentioned so many times now: lust, hatred, delusion. So long as it's driven by those, and all Western philosophical schools, as well as Eastern, if I'm going to say Western, then there's Eastern. Because ignorance does not have skin color. It doesn't have a certain passport. It doesn't come with a certain race. Okay? Ignorance is ignorance. And that also includes, it doesn't come with a certain religion per se. Because in Buddhism, in this day and age, I can lead you to some places in the world where they even practice Theravada Buddhism, supposedly. For all intents and purposes, they are, until you go closely look at them. You look at their behavior, you look at their real behavior, day to day. How they relate with other Buddhists, other individuals in different parts of Asia. And you're going to be shocked. Because the same poisons I mentioned in the Western philosopher's heart is there in robes as a Buddhist monk. We don't have to go too far. You just go back about, nearly almost 80 years, 85 years to around the time of the Second World War in the 40s. You go maybe even earlier in Japan, Imperial Japan. You actually had Zen monks, Zen Buddhist monks in Japan who were marching with rifles in hand. Troops of Zen monks. Because there was an imperial decree and the emperor was basically not just seeing himself as the savior of Buddhism in Asia, but he was promoted into thinking and validated in his thinking, and that deluded thinking. Emperor Hirohito of Japan. You had Zen Buddhist teachers, lay and monastic, who were thinking of Japanese culture, the emperor, the imperial forces, as the saviors of Buddhism in Asia. This is not coming from me. This is coming from history. You had individuals who were saying, we are spreading the Dharma in their case. We are spreading and reigniting the Buddha's teachings in Asia by the help of the compassionate sword. Oh yeah. They were butchering Chinese people in Manchuria when the Japanese invaded China. You had individuals like very well-known 20th century scholars, Zen or Buddhist scholars, such as D.T. Suzuki, very famous in the Western world, who was advocating such ideologies. And guess what? He never regretted them until the moment of his death. He never said, I'm sorry for, even after Japan's defeat, he never said, I'm sorry for those wrong, at least wrong concepts and wrong, evil ways of interpreting the Dharma, manipulating the teaching so that it becomes a vehicle of domination And that's what we have in philosophy. So you see, it's not something that's only found or seen in Western philosophies today. No, you have it everywhere. And it will continue because war has become the greatest resource. War itself. And similarly, all those warmongering thinkers, which basically are driven by the same three poisons, will use whatever is in their disposal to push for that. Because anything that helps move one's objectives further, that's what they'll do. So Buddhism has nothing to do with rhetoric, with argumentation, which is what essentially Western philosophy is all about. Rhetoric is what has been carried over into the realm of judicial systems, court systems, where you go and talk to any lawyer in America and they'll say, yeah, ultimately the truth doesn't matter. It's how well you can actually carry the case to make a case, meaning convincing arguments. Well, most people think it's the same thing as truth. No. It has nothing to do with the truth most of the time. Most. That's why the Buddha called these characters eel wrigglers. An eel you cannot hold, right? It slips through your fingers. That's how these people are. You try to get them to say something definitive, something that's concrete, but it changes because they're so swift in changing their position, just like politicians, depending on what's serving them. Because these individuals are run not by truth, which was and is what you see in the Buddha's teachings, original teachings. You look for the Buddha's statements to kind of change. If you come from a Western philosophy or philosophical education like I did. But I couldn't find anything that where I would go, see, yeah, he was shifty. No, it carries through. I earlier gave the example of the 4 right efforts, right? You can easily go and pick the Noble Eightfold Path, from which comes the right effort part I mentioned. It's a step-by-step process. It guides you from a state of dullness, a state of ignorance, pain, a state of suffering, to a state of that is without suffering, that you're happy. Show me one school of philosophy that does that. Western philosophy. Or even Eastern philosophy. Some people call it, Taoism. Yeah, but still it's very foggy. There is not a single system. Eventually Taoism turned into, the immortal or seeking immortality, which is a big joke. I'm yet to see a single Taoist immortal, ever. They all die, as expected. So when people talk about philosophy, they forget that, unfortunately, it's all about dividing and separating societies. Divide and conquer. Remember that? That method is still is very well kept alive, because today, as I mentioned, war is a resource, but so is education, which is why it's suffering tremendously in the world. The lack in education, that's why people are so gullible. The level of understanding, comprehension, processing of information, looking for patterns, being somewhat of an investigator, examining properly, is non-existent now. People are wanting to be influenced by the videos that they look at, the TikToks or shorties, I think they're called, on YouTube or something like that, where their attention span is so short, and they need to look at someone who's already famous so that they're looking for just one hook, one thing that this speaker says, and they become devout followers. That's not the proper way of processing information, of making your own decisions based on careful analysis. That analysis is out the window. During COVID time, this was proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, where human beings, we failed miserably. Any basic level, entry level detective could have seen through what was happening. Because you look for patterns, you look for evidence, you look for, well, who could be benefiting from this? Same thing with the world events. Again, without deviating too much, because there's so much corruption, there's so much evil currently in the world on such a massive scale, where there is no truth anymore that's being talked about, let alone coming from the Western philosophical schools, because you're not going to find this. It's just, you have just talking heads, that's all you have. There's nothing there. So what do? You look at yourself and you ask the simple question, am I suffering? And you don't need much convincing if you're just staying with yourself for a few minutes. You can look at your body, you can look at your pulse, you can look at your thoughts coming in. Are they rushing in? Like, are they moving about in a crazy fashion? Are you getting agitated very quickly? That's a sign. It doesn't have to be a physical pain where you're being pierced by some sharp object to be called pain, or heat or something. No. Emotionally, are you happy? That's another way to start on the right path. Then what that means is you just touch the pulse of life. There's nothing intellectual, academic about that. You don't have to read Plato for that, to understand that, and never get anywhere. You don't have to study, I don't know, Foucault or these characters. Wittgenstein and his fake existentialism. That's why he ended up killing himself. Miserable people. But then you look at what the Buddha is teaching. The Noble Eightfold Path is called Arya, It's called noble for a reason. Because it lifts you up from a state of ignoble, being in suffering, to a state that is free from suffering. The Buddha said, we are living in happiness, about himself and the group of bhikkhus. He didn't even have to say it. Everybody saw that. That's why they kept coming. The kings used to come to visit him. Courtesans used to come to visit, and they were changing their lives. Criminals were dropping their past behaviors and adopting a new life of virtue. So yes, there's absolutely nothing in common with Western philosophical schools and Buddhism. Because ultimately, the Buddha's method is dealing with the most pervasive algorithm you can think of. And that is the inner habitual drives that run the show in the minds and hearts of people. And we have a term for that. They're the sankharas, which I like to call, I used to translate them, I still do actually, as habitual drives. Sometimes they're called volitional formations and things like that by other translators, but I like to call them habitual drives because they drive a person to do things. So long as there's no sati, there's no mindfulness, there's no wisdom. However, when you carefully look at what the Sankharas are doing, in modern parlance, you could say they have very close association with what we understand in the computer world as algorithms. Algorithm. What is your algorithm there for? Because that's what's going to dictate how the system functions. And if you're looking around and you're seeing a world that's in chaos, well, it's because they've been following philosophical schools that they've come up with that serve their purpose, just like the Enlightenment age served the purposes of those who wanted to dismantle the monarchies in Europe. Successfully, they did. And later on in the 19th century, early 19th century, they also did with the Ottoman Empire. They also did with the Russian czars and a bunch of other monarchies. Successfully. Divide and conquer. And now you look at the world. What's happening? What's really happening? And that requires us to be honest with what we're seeing, instead of being fooled by what the titles are. You know, this whole diversity thing, equality, DEI, I think it's called, has nothing to do with promoting diversity, this and that. No, it's after one thing, dividing people. And then you can make what happen? Chaos! In the 70s, there was this, chaos theory and all that. They're still pushing for that. And, Pavlovian thinking around the 19th century, beginning of it, right? That's still carrying over because they look at a human being as a completely someone without any volition. Basically, you are, that's what they said, World Economic Forum, that Yuval character. Says human beings, what is that? Programmable, that's what you are. We give you drugs, we give you video games, you're dumb. You're nothing. He's actually said this on many occasions. And they're promoting what? Big titles, just like they did in the Enlightenment age, right? Égalité, liberté, fraternité, all that nonsense. They talk about, acceptance of protecting nature, protecting climates, protecting, society, all these things, values. Meanwhile, you look at them. What are they doing? Really? Look at the behavior. Don't look at the fluffy language they use. Has nothing to do with that. Has nothing to do with that. Look at the behavior of the person. That's why we look at the Buddha's behavior throughout the 45 years. You don't see a tiny little stain even in his behavior. None. He never brandished, he never showed off a sword or a stick or a cane. In fact, he said the opposite. He said, he who carries a sword is going to be cut by one. Because when you carry a sword, you are saying, I am ready to assault at least. I am ready to beat. I am ready to draw blood. I am ready to kill. That's what you're doing when you're carrying a weapon. That's it. There's no way of justifying it. Now bring to mind those Buddhist monks from Japan. There's actual books. I once was writing a summary of it about 30 years ago or something. And the cover was, I forgot the name of it. It's still available, I think, probably on Amazon. But the cover of it is an actual picture taken in Japan, where you see bald-headed Zen monks, priests basically, marching like soldiers. They are soldiers with weapons. While German captains, the Imperial Japanese soldiers are training them to go to battle. This is just ludicrous. This has nothing to do with Buddhism. So philosophy as such, and that's why I disagree with some Buddhist monks, some famous Buddhist monks who said, "Oh yes, Buddhism is a philosophy." You just put it in a box, my friend. Buddhism is not a philosophy. Philosophers in those days used to come to debate with the Buddha. The Buddha's mission there was not to engage in arguments. The Buddha would simply engage if he saw that the person had the capacity to break through their ignorance. Many of them were ready, because many of them were interested in finding out the truth, because they were in pain deeply. They didn't have this, eel-wriggling techniques that we see in modern day philosophers especially, that are after conceit. It's driven by conceit. Fame, that's another thing that we have today. So social media is another resource. War is a resource, therefore. The promotion of that, that's why we're running into this major problem now of perpetual wars in the world. So we need a reintroduction of Buddhism to the people, so that the people could see what is right from what is wrong, and most of it is wrong, just like the 62 views were wrong at the time of the Buddha. And that's why they hated him. They hated him. But it doesn't matter. Truth is truth. Lord Buddha says there are 4 sources of brilliance, sources of powerful light. He says the first is the sun. Second is the full moon on a dark night. Third is fire. And then there's the fire brilliance of wisdom. He says out of these 4, the last is the most brightest, because it cannot be covered. It cannot be dimmed. So 2,600 years almost have passed, and the light of the Dhamma taught by Lord Buddha himself cannot be dimmed by all this ignorance, Buddhist or not, that's prevalent in the world. Sukhyot.